Sicha about unity and separation. Essentially, Sicha about Kalayim. That is the whole category of mitzvahs, that things that separately are permitted, but when you put them together, poof, all of a sudden they become forbidden. So we see that with agriculture, grains, don't sow other stuff in your vineyard. Also don't mix grains together when you sow, because even if not everything is exactly planted by rows, they could all start feeding off each other. Everything according to its kind. Don't plow with an ox and a donkey together, which even though that's the step before crossbreeding, it could lead to crossbreeding, and either way it's still forbidden. So that's forbidden, and crossbreeding is forbidden. Agriculture, grafting is forbidden. You can't mix the seeds and you can't graft. And then don't wear a mixture of wool and linen, and a garment of wool and linen shall not come upon you. The specification of a garment shall not come upon you. That's anything that you can wear, anything that acts as like a garment on you. So like a towel, I think bedlin is not allowed, belt, all this stuff, shanas becomes forbidden. And then at first it's like, well, shanas is an acronym, because what is that word? Where does it come from? They say shanas is an acronym of different ways that you can combine threads. Comb, spun, and woven together. Is it only those three that makes it forbidden? And then ultimately we see it, the rabbis say it's any kind of combination that makes it forbidden. So even if it be like felt, you somehow press it together, it'll still be forbidden. The question that we have is that we see that there's an exemption for shanas when it comes to tzitzis. And to the extent that it talks about when you tie the tzitzis, remember we saw also one of the commentaries, that when you tie the tzitzis, you're only making a knot, well, you're making a few knots, you're making knots, and even that's prohibited. So you're not actually sewing, you're not combining these materials through any sort of sewing or any sort of thread combination, you're literally just tying it on, and that becomes permitted. And why would the Torah permit it? To tell us that usually it would be forbidden. If you do the mantra of tzitzis, tzaddik is 90, yud is 10, tzaddik is 90, yud is 10, tuf is 400, that gives you 600. Then you have 4 strings that you fold in half, that gives you 8. And then they're knotted with 5 knots. So that gives you 13. So it's 613. So the whole thing is that you're looking at your tzitzis, that reminds you about keeping the mitzvah. Now, the way that it used to be is that you'd have 3 of the strings were white and 1 string was tchelet. Tchelet is kind of like a turquoise color, blue turquoise kind of color. The dye came from a very specific animal called the chalazin. I think we spoke about this. We don't know what that color is. So sometimes you see people who wear tzitzis or they have a talit that has the blue on it, but we don't know. It's a very specific dye. We don't know what it is anymore. The Rebbe says about the whole thing with the threads, 3 white and 1 blue. The white, remember, is chesed. Remember, the white goes toward mercy, toward chesed, and the tchelet is yira, is fear. So you're supposed to see it, and you remember the mitzvah, but you remember with love and fear. So the Rebbe says, today we don't know what tchelet is, we don't know what the fear color is, which is to show our predominant mode of service these days is a love-based service. Anyways, we see the exemption of tzitzis tells us something. And then also we see that the belt, the avnate of the Kohanim, of the priests in the Beit HaMikdash, was made out of shatnez. So what's with the exemptions? One more category that gets added into this is the category of meat and milk. It also becomes part of the kalayim category because it's 2 things that were permitted and then you put it together, it becomes forbidden. Now, meat and milk, we had a question about, maybe it could still be used for holy stuff. Maybe there's an exemption for it. And then ultimately we say there's not. Who even thought to ask the question if there might be an exemption for it? Well, part of that is because when you look at the Torah prohibition of meat and milk, it doesn't forbid it until the cooking stage. So they're just putting it together stage is not forbidden. The rabbis forbade that stage. They said don't even go there. Kind of with the ox and the donkey, like don't even go to that level, so don't even go with the combining stage, whether or not you're cooking it. So we see that because there's something slightly different about the meat and milk, we might have had a question about it, where the stages are. That's only part of it. Ultimately, we'll see when we get to the final answer. You'll see how everything comes together. Now, there is something different about shatnez, besides the fact that there's an exemption, and that's because even though you combine it, you can take it apart afterwards. Unlike grafting, unlike crossbreeding, you can't take it apart, and even meat and milk, once you cook it, you can't take it apart. Shatnez is still forbidden, wool and linen is still forbidden, and yet we see there's something different. Not just that, but as we mentioned, it's the only one that combines 2 different kingdoms together. Grafting is plant kingdom, plant kingdom. Crossbreeding is animal kingdom, animal kingdom. Meat and milk is also animal kingdom, and then shatnez is plant kingdom and animal kingdom. There is something different about shatnez, even though it's equally forbidden, which is also part of why it's part of chukim, is part of these statutes that they don't make any sense. And your Yetzer Hara will come to you. Really, you're keeping this one? Like, who cares about this one? Last time was part 2 of a whole Ramban that sidebarred into the sidebar into the sidebar, all about the abomination of the nations, where it talks about how the land kind of spit them out because it can't handle them. What were these abominations? The word kalayim was in there somewhere within the whole commentary, but most of the commentary was talking about the difference between sorcery and divination, and then all the other stuff that were considered abominations like sorcery. So people would sacrifice their kids to the Moloch, idolatry, black magics and stuff like that they would practice. But part of what the idea was that constellations and things like that do have a certain power. As in, God has allotted to them certain sort of divine energies that they then allot to that which they're over. Someone who grafts, mixing meat and milk and stuff like that, you're crossing wires, and then the angels don't know what they're supposed to be doing kind of idea. There's more to it than just that. We see that there's other parts to it, because they do have some sort of access to divine energy powers. They're not the sole arbiters of it. That's where the mistake of idolatry came in, to say like, oh look, they have power, so we should worship them. Nah, they're really just conduits. They can't do anything that God doesn't let them do. The abominations were that they were believing in this kind of stuff, and then it separated divination because people kind of want to know what happens to them in the future. So the fact that, the birds are flying in this pattern tells us something, okay, like sort of, and there is something to that. But then Ramban is also very clear about the fact we have a direct line to God, so we don't do that kind of stuff. Why would you go chasing after the servant when you have the direct access to the master? That's part of what the land of Israel, there's something holier to it, tangibly holy to it. That's why it can't handle those abominations, spits out the other peoples. There were other nations that were doing these things, these other trespasses, these abominations, but we don't see their land spitting them out. Egypt didn't spit out the Egyptians, not because it's permitted, but it's not as holy as Israel. There's something much holier about the land of Israel, which is why we got to be better behaved. We have to be well behaved, and we have to be well behaved on steroids in Israel, because the land itself has a sense for it. Because it has direct access to God. It's the one land that doesn't have its sar. It's the one land that doesn't have a mediator, the celestial being that rules over it. Every other land, every other country has the celestial being that's the conduit to it. But the land of Israel has no conduit. It's direct access to God. There's no middleman there when you talk about the divine energies that are coming down and being allotted. That brings us back to the verse from Parshas Mishpatim of Lo savasha gedi b'chel yimo, you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Now we're going to have a long Rebbe Bachya about mixing meat and milk. Now, obviously, there's way more in here than there's supposed to be, so there's several extra paragraphs than what the Sicha actually references. Rebbe Bachya, Lo savasha gedi b'chel yimo, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. This verse, identically worded, appears 3 times in the Torah. I've spoken about this before, about how there's 3 prohibitions of meat and milk. You're not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to benefit from it. By the way, versus the other kind of kalayim, because you're not allowed to graft, but you are allowed to eat grafted fruit. So there is a difference there. Shanas, you're not allowed to make the shanas, but it also says don't wear it. And it says don't crossbreed, but it doesn't tell you that you're not allowed to use a mule. You can still use a mule. You just can't make the mule. Now, officially, nobody's supposed to be making it, but if someone makes it, then you're allowed to use the mule. As in if someone forces the crossbreeding to happen. But when it comes to meat and milk, there's 3 times the prohibition is stated to tell us that there's 3 different aspects to the prohibition. The other ones, they don't necessarily have those 3 prohibitions attached to it. Our sages in Chulin interpret this to mean that the prohibition is threefold. So the sages say, why is it written 3 times? Because there's 3 parts of the prohibition. Not to cook it together, not to consume such a mixture, not to use it in any other form, as in sell it, etc. The reason the Torah chose to word the prohibition in this way is that the Torah injunction is cooking these 2 matters together. These 2 things together. Consuming meat and milk, which was cooked together as a Torah prohibition, punishable by 39 lashes if violated intentionally. Eating meat and drinking a glass of raw milk with it, while forbidden by rabbinic decree, does not carry this penalty. This is what we spoke about, that the prohibition is still the prohibition, but depending on where it comes from, that affects the rectification of it. This is the opinion of my teacher Rashba. Rebbe Menachem is referring to his teacher Rashba, who says there's difference in what gets lashes. We could ask why the Torah did not simply write the words, lo sochel, you should not eat. So why didn't the Torah tell us that? Why does it say don't cook it a bunch of times instead of telling us don't cook it, don't eat it, don't sell it? The Torah should be more clear. It didn't have to repeat, it could have been clearer. A formula which traditionally includes the prohibition to enjoy such a substance in any other form. Compare Pesachim, says in the Gemara. As in, it's not just the cheeseburger that's prohibited. You can't just eat meat and drink a glass of milk at the same time, even though you haven't cooked it together. It's still prohibited because there's still an enjoyment that you're getting from it. So you can't enjoy the combination of the 2 in any other kind of format. So Rebbe Menachem is saying, why didn't the Torah just tell us that? Instead, it's giving us this, know that when I say this, all the other categories that come to it. The reason is that if the Torah had written those words, I would have assumed that culpability for eating such a mixture occurs only if one enjoys eating it, as is the case with other prohibitions of that kind. I was like, because if you would have told us that, I would have been like, but I'm not enjoying it, I don't like it. So if you have a vegetarian or vegan and you force them to eat a cheeseburger and like, this is disgusting, then maybe they didn't transgress a prohibition because they didn't even like it. By not using the word do not eat, the Torah implies that even if a mixture of cooked meat and milk was consumed while it is too hot to enjoy or even burned one's tissue, the prohibition and culpability for it still apply. Too hot, I didn't taste it, I burned my tongue. No, you're still culpable. The Torah didn't get more specific about the wording. The Torah was giving us a wider prohibition, so that's why it kept the language in a certain kind of way. Seeing that the Torah was unable to use the words lo sochel, do not eat, it became necessary to write the same verse 3 times in order to convey to us all the aspects of this prohibition. Nonetheless, the penalty of 39 lashes is applied only to cooking it or eating it even without enjoying it. So even if you didn't like it, you're still culpable. Other aspects of the prohibition, such as selling a mixture, is not punishable, though prohibited. Compare Pesachim 25. Okay, so there's another part of Pesachim. That's another part of the Gemara that tells it to us. So you have 3 prohibitions of meat and milk, but because they're not all clearly stated by the Torah, the culpability, the rectification of it is different. Say, why wouldn't you just be clear about it? The Torah just kept it broad so we can ask the question and come to the answer. There are only 2 prohibitions of eating something which do not provide one with some enjoyment or satisfaction for which a Torah culpability exists. One is arvus, the other is a mixture of grapes and some other seed planted too close to it. Sound familiar, anybody? Kilayim. In accordance with this, the sages in Pesachim, so another part of the Gemara, stated that all scholars are agreed that the penalty of 39 lashes is applicable to someone who deliberately eats from Kilaya Karim. This mixture of grapes and other species planted right next to the grapes, even if eating from the mixture was of no benefit or pleasure to the person eating it. Let's say someone's just really, really hungry and you're feeling weak and you're like, oh look, there's this thing growing in the vineyard, and you go eat it. You're not even enjoying it, you just need to put nutrients into your system, so I don't even enjoy it. The Torah's like, still, no, it doesn't matter if you enjoyed it or not. It's not allowed. Prohibited. That and meat and milk together. The reason advanced to that ruling is the fact that in prohibiting the mixture, the Torah refrained from using the words, do not eat. But it wrote, Pen tikdash amlea zerasher tizos sakar. Lest increase, even the seed that you sow and yield to the vineyard both become forbidden. Here it says, that's the verse that we saw originally about that part of Kalayim. So it's on the first page that we saw that originally. In condition, so again, it's another tractate, the words pen tikdash are understood as pen tukad h, so that no light be lit with it, i.e. so that no use be made of it. Don't get any use of it. According to the plain meaning of our text, the reason for this whole commandment, why do we have this mitzvah, is that the practice of cooking the kid in the milk of its mother is apt to deaden feelings of compassion in the human heart. It courses one's entire personality. After all, milk is a derivative of the animal's blood. Consumption of blood courses a person's personality, causing a person to develop feelings of cruelty. It says kedamu nefesh, that the life is in the blood. Part of why there's massive prohibitions against eating blood, which is why the blood libels are always so stupid. The whole idea that they used a blood libel to try to pogrom and massacre Jewish people, the whole thing was so convoluted, not just because it's convoluted. There's so many prohibitions against eating blood. One of the reasons consumption of blood is prohibited to Jews by the Torah is the fact that contrary to other parts of the animal, blood does not become assimilated by the body of the person eating it in the same manner as your other parts of the animal's tissue. In other words, the negative influence of blood remains in the body without being sublimated. So it just gets part of the circulatory system. Even though in the meantime, this blood has been converted into milk, and one by itself does not transport the negative elements of blood to people drinking the milk, the moment it's mixed again with flesh and cooked together, it reverts its original negative character coarsening properties. So the blood turns into milk. The milk you can drink safely. But as soon as you cook the milk with flesh, as in with meat, it reverts back to its origin point of blood. And then you're eating blood, which you're not allowed to do, because that coarsens you. Doctors believe that the same is true when fish is mixed with cheese and cooked together. Some people eat cheese and milk together and some people won't. It's kind of like a back and forth about that. So there are people who won't eat fish and cheese or dairy products together, and there's some people who do. And it's kind of like what level you're at. It's not the same as meat and milk. This would account for the prohibition in Yeridea, item 87. Not only will consuming a dish prepared by such ingredients in such a manner produce coarseness of character, but it also produce some form of tzarat. Tzarat there was translated as leprosy, but it's really a spiritual affliction. We don't have tzarat these days. It's not really leprosy, because it's not caused by anything that's not spiritual. It's caused by people who would say Lashon Hara. Who would get tzaras, would be punished with tzaras, because that's why you have to go through a self-refining process. But it's not something you could just catch. The reason that every time you find this verse, it appears in connection with the pilgrimage festivals, is in order to warn the pilgrims who come to Yerushalayim 3 times a year. The Holy Side prophets were active, not to coarsen their hearts by consuming forbidden foods, but to ensure that the physical bodies remain as pure and conducive to mediate in the ways of Torah, and their hearts should be prepared to conceptualize the knowledge of the Blessed One. If you remember the first time we saw this verse, we saw the full verse, and it told us, the choicest of the first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house of Avai Elokecha. Those are Bikurim. That's the holiday of Shavuos. And then the rest of the verse is, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Rebbe is saying, have you noticed that every time it gives the prohibition, it's in connection with one of the holidays, the 3 pilgrim holidays, the Shalosh Regalim, so it's Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So these verses always appear in relation to the verses that speak about going up for these holidays. So why would that be? Because he's trying to say you're going up, you have to be in a heightened spiritual state, to be in a more refined state, so the prohibition is coming there because it's trying to tell you something. Not following this leads to a coarsened state. Rambam in its Moreh Nevuchim is the guide for the perplexed. 3rd part, chapter 48, writes concerning this prohibition that seeing it was a custom of the pagans to eat milk and meat in their temples on their festivals, the Torah forbade this practice. And the verse says, when shall come 3 times in the year to the house of Avai Elokecha, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, as is the practice of the pagans. The whole idea of guide for the perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, is that it's giving us a more logical, philosophical approach to things. It needs to be rational to me to accept it more, so that we could drag you in, so that you could really learn everything in depth the way you should. You see a lot of it connects to idolatrous practices. We saw that also with Shanas, that the priests of the temples, of the idolatrous temples, of the pagans, would wear wool and linen together. And because the Torah wants to eradicate anything that has anything to do with idolatry, the Torah is just like, stay away from all of that. Someone who's not necessarily at the level where they'd be like, oh, whatever God says I'm going to do, because they can, no, we're enlightened beings. We have to have a reason for it. Someone like that can understand it has pagan origins to it, and we don't do the pagan stuff, so we just don't do it. Someone like that, they go, okay, I see where you're coming from. It doesn't seem as far-fetched as, don't mix up justice and mercy. They're like, what are you talking about? If they're not ready to hear that answer, you can give them an answer that's much more like, look, there was idolatrous stuff going on. We have no association with any of the idolatrous stuff. Therefore, the verse reminds us of this in 2 places in connection with the festivals, for such is the way of the Torah, to forbid pagan practices, and to command us to do the opposite, to destroy the source of foreign worship from the world. God has no tolerance for idolatry. This is what Rambam writes as the reason for this mitzvah, and even though I have not quoted his words verbatim, this is his intent. It is fairly clear that these various reasons are not an adequate explanation and are not the main reason in Moreh Nevuchim, but to delay the questioner for this mitzvah is from the category of chukim, like the red heifer and the goat sent to Azazel. As in, this is not the ultimate reason why we do stuff, but Rambam Moreh Nevuchim is trying to like, here, chew on this, we'll get back to you kind of thing, because it's a chok, we don't fully understand it. And so the sages explain that in the time to come, Hashem will reveal to the Jewish people why the Torah commanded on milk and meat, the red heifer, and the scapegoat. Red heifer is the paraduma. We don't know the answer for it now. In the time to come, our sages say we will know the answer. That's part of what we said originally. The whole thing of a chok, that it's the king's decree. King says, I want you to do it, so you got to do this. Just because the king doesn't give us a reason doesn't mean there isn't one. So the sages are saying, when Mashiach comes, we'll have the reasons for it. It's not for now. You don't need to know it. Fulfill it. And because this is the opinion of the sages that this mitzvah is from the hidden of the Torah, for certainly in the time to come, there will not be dullness of heart or idolatry, for we are assured by the promise of Devarim, and Avaya will circumcise your hearts, and so in the promise in Tzefania is one of the prophets, for then I will convert the people to a pure language, and all of them call on the name of Avaya to worship him of one accord. But this mitzvah has a secret dimension. First of all, he's saying, well, how come we're going to know about it in the time to come? Because we'll be more spiritually sensitive in the time to come. We're going to be cleansed in the time to come. There's not going to be any of the dullness of the heart, idolatry. There's not going to be these other things that can affect us before the time to come. So then we're going to be ready to hear the answer for these things. Now that he explained it on the basic level, now we're going to find out the secret about it. What is the secret? From here is actually where the Sicha references a Kabbalistic approach. You are aware that all the commandments are divine and reflect something parallel to condition which exists in the celestial regions. Everything, all the mitzvos, they're divine and there's a reflection in the higher realms. The same applies to the commandments known as chukim. They are called thus as they reflect matters engraved, chakuk, in the celestial realms. Chakuk, like the word of chakika. Chukim, ches, kuf, which means we say statutes, laws we don't understand, but it's like the word chakuk, engraved, chakika, which means an engraving. They're engraved in celestial realms. These are laws that are written into the wiring of the higher universes. We saw something about this already. The legislation of meat and milk is an example of this. So it's an example of something that is a law of the higher realms. Just as each of these components by itself is permissible and only mixing them is prohibited, so the Torah had to be especially stringent in its prohibition against mixing two perfectly permissible items with one another, because otherwise we wouldn't know. Were this not so, we would find it difficult to understand that joining two permitted substances and making one out of them is so harmful to the condition of God's universe. We'd be set loose at the chem lab. We don't know that mixing this stuff is harmful. We already saw an example of it from the Shalah, that you're mixing up justice and mercy. So we would know that if God hadn't told us, because we're like, hey, this is permitted, why can't I put it together? God's like, no, don't do that. Don't touch. It is like a lesson not to confuse the kind of holiness which exists in the celestial regions with the sanctity which exists, or is the aim of the Torah to establish in our terrestrial world. So just because there's a measure of holiness that works in the higher realms doesn't mean it works in the lower realms, as in the physical realm. Spiritual and physical are not the same thing. The things don't work the same way. It's like the idea of the Nephilim. These are the angels that they saw man was created, and they're busy watching man go off, the generations coming after Adam, and the angels are like, what's the big deal with humans? Look at them. Like, we could do better. And God's like, no, you can't. Yes, we can. Give us a chance. So God says on earth, and it wasn't a long time before they got corrupted. The angels got totally corrupted. Just because up in heaven you understand where you came from and you understand stuff about the universe, it doesn't necessarily apply to this physical realm. So these angels that are called Nephilim, the fallen ones, they were angels. They're called fallen because in heaven they're angels. They know who they are, what their job is, etc. But you put them on earth, they don't know it takes a different kind of being to exist in this world and to make the right decisions in this world. And angels are not cut out for that. So that's why they got corrupted very quickly. Even when optimum conditions of sanctity exist in our part of the universe, this does not mean that these two types of holiness can be part of the same brew, quote unquote. Can be mixed as if they were all the same. Again, it's not the same. What works in heaven does not necessarily work on earth. Not in a negative sense, but in the sense of an angel who's so perfect up in heaven doesn't mean he can live in this physical realm. It's not the same thing. We're not wired for the same kinds of existence. They don't understand what it is to live in a world of darkness and challenge because they don't have that where they are. As long as there is a Yetzer Hara, so as long as we have an evil force at work in our world, God and his name are not one and the same. As in, we see there's challenges, there's darkness. These two kinds of holiness are still apart and do not mix. It is our task to strive in this world to bring about a merging of these two kinds of holiness. Remember how we learned about how the fusion happened in Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah? All the generations until the giving of the Torah, it was not an option to mix the spiritual with the physical. That's why things didn't retain holiness. But once Hashem gave us the Torah in Har Sinai, it now became an option for us to make things holy, to imbue things with holiness. As in, God was allowing the spiritual and the physical to mix. But it doesn't just happen, we make it happen. When our sages in Masechet Gan Eden, so the different places talking about, said that in the future God revealed to us the meaning of the legislation in his Torah, including the reason for the prohibition of mixing milk and meat, what they meant was that although these commandments, these mitzvot, have been given to us to fulfill in this terrestrial world, or in the physical realm, the condition of this world is not such that it is appropriate to reveal to us the mystical dimension of this legislation as long as this world is infested with the Yetzer Hara. So as long as the evil inclination is here, God can't tell us the real reason for why certain things are. This world can't handle it. We can't handle it in this world. If God were to reveal this information to us in our present state of spiritual/intellectual imperfection, it might sow doubt in our minds rather than an additional resolve to observe the mitzvah meticulously. So instead of enlightening us, it might actually turn us against stuff. The example of the four sages who went to Pardes, it says, Arba shenichnasu lePardes, one died, one went crazy, one became a heretic, and only Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and left in peace. Acher, who became a heretic, saw the higher dimensions, and he essentially couldn't handle it. And he ended up flipping. He ended up becoming a heretic. The only sage that we have on record, to the extent that they don't even call him by his name. Elisha ben Avuya, they don't call him that. They're like, he's the other one, Acher. Because sometimes knowing too much is too much. We might, God forbid, conclude that there are two competing divine powers which control the universe. In the future, after the power of the evil urge will have been broken, and when there is no fear that we would therefore misunderstand the reasons for this legislation, God will reveal it to us. So this may lead us to think that there's more than God existing in the world, so because of that, we can't know the real answer. This is a Kabbalistic approach for why there are chukim, things that are engraved within the celestial realms that we cannot understand here in the physical realm. This will be the period when the deserving dead will be resurrected. I mean, so that when Tchias Mesim, that's Mashiach comes, only then will the concept up, on that day, Havaya and his name will be one, and the same, i.e. the two levels of sanctity, will merge. In fact, at that time, the prohibition of mixing meat and milk will become redundant. You now have an incentive. In case nothing else we said about Mashiach coming was going to do it for you, you can have your cheeseburger. You can even have bacon. This explains why the angels who visited Abraham could eat butter and meat at the same time, as it appears from Bereshit that Abraham served it both simultaneously. The angels that went to visit Abraham, he gave them tongue and mustard. But also there's an indication there that they were eating butter within the same meal with the meat. How could that happen if that's not kosher? So it said because angels are not existing on the same plane. Besides, whether or not angels really eat, but the fact it's not a prohibition for them because they're not existing the same level of sanctity. So for them, it's a redundancy. For us, it's not because you can't handle the truth. Seeing that the angels don't have an evil urge, there's no evil inclination in an angel. They're robotically programmed. They can only do what their one job is. This restriction does not apply to them. So because of us, we have the competing forces in us, kind of like we were saying with Cain and Hevel, that you had one leaned into the spirit of impurity and one leaned into the spirit of holiness. So you have that option. Angels don't have that option, but we do. And as long as that option exists in the world, we can't handle the truth about certain things. People could go crazy from it. Once the evil urge will have been abolished, there will therefore be no need for this mitzvah. Here it's saying it's cautionary because you don't know what you're doing when you're mixing this stuff. But once you get to the level that it's not going to be a risk anymore, then we don't have to have the mitzvah anymore, per se. This is what prompted our sages in Yoma, so another tractate, to say and explain in Vayikra, Es chokos tishmaru, you shall observe my statutes. We saw that verse. As meaning, I engraved them, and you have no right to investigate their meaning or criticize them, as any such criticism would undermine this terrestrial universe in which the evil urge is still rampant. As in, what I have is a chok, as in connected to the language, we say the statutes connected to the language of engraving. God says, I have given this to you, and you got to do it. You don't get to go and try to pontificate about it because you cannot understand it. He doesn't need to have a reason, but he does. God has a reason for it, but you can't understand it. So you just have to know this is just something that you got to keep because I said so. This is why in a similar verse in Vayikra, the verse concludes with the justification, quote unquote, I am Avaya. As in, why you do this? That's because I'm God. That's why. Not just God. I'm Avaya God. The plain meaning of the verse is Zechariah, so prophet. On that day, Avaya will be one and his name will be one. So it's Vaya Bayamu Yi Havayachad Ushmoachad. We saw it like a few lines up. Is a reference to mankind worshiping. The message is that from that day onwards, all of mankind will serve only Hashem. There will no longer be any competing religions. When we say Mashiach comes, everyone's going to recognize that this is God's world. One God. We're all going to serve one God. And everybody's going to want to serve the one God. Which is going to show that all kinds of people will still be here when Mashiach first comes. And everyone's going to be like, oh, yeah, God. Why didn't you tell us about him? Well, we tried to. He didn't want to listen to us. Nobody likes a conscience. That's why Pinocchio really squished Jiminy Cricket when he tried to be like, hey, don't do that. Not the Disney version. They took that part out. They figured it wouldn't sell as much if you don't have the cricket merchandise. You kill him too early in the film. The word echad, like Shema Yisrael Avaya Keno Avaya Echad, means that at that time we will pronounce the tetragrammaton, which is the name of Avaya, as we read it, not by substituting the letters Aleph Daled of Adonai, because we are not worthy to utter the word with Yud Hey, as in Kibir Psachim see it in Tractate Psachim. As in, we are going to be at such a state that the name of Avaya, which we usually pronounce as Ado, so Adonai, that we usually pronounce it differently, we're actually going to be able to actually say the name properly. We don't pronounce the name these days. Not since the destruction, we don't say the name anymore. Because we're not at a level, we can't say the name anymore. When Mashiach comes, we're going to be at such a holy state. When God's name will be one, then we can actually say God's name that has been revealed as the oneness that it is. To summarize, section 5. And then we will have to do the text of section 6 next. For Kalayim, one side is from the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Spirit of Holiness, and one is from the evil spirit or the spirit of impurity. So what you have Kalayim is that you have a mixture of two things, that one is from a not good place and one's from a good place. And we are commanded to go after Ruach HaKodesh. We're commanded to go after the holy side of things and distance ourselves from evil. These mixtures were forbidden because it combines these two sides. That's essentially what we said over here. That's the real Kabbalistic approach for why Kalayim is forbidden to us. Because it's a mixture of two separate things, and that's not going to be good. And because we don't understand that, God just has to put the prohibition in place to just be like, hey, don't go here. That's another dimension, explanation of why the prohibition of Kalayim, why we have that. End of section 5.